We're going to go to Genesis chapter 12 and verses 1 to 9 this morning. Genesis 12, 1 to 9. And here we have the call of Abraham, or as he was known in those days, Abram. His name got changed later on, so don't be confused. If you hear Abram and Abraham, it's the same man. It's just that God later on said he was going to be called by a different name. But he starts off as Abram. And when preaching, I should probably use the name Abraham because that's the one, of course, that we are most familiar with. Later on, but for the sake of the reading, we'll stick to the text today. Okay, so Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran, and he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all his possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram travelled through the land as far as the site of the great trees of Moreh at Shechem. And at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar to the Lord there, who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. Well, I often read in various documents that come through, articles that I get, etc., that come on the subject of preaching. I often read that we're encouraged to make our preaching practical. And when you start to dig deep into what they actually mean, what they mean is make your preaching shallow. That's actually what it means. You see, we're going to look today at a new series. We're going to begin, The People of Blessing. And the thing is that in order to make the teaching practical, you actually have to dig deep. We've got to be like little children. Jesus told us that, didn't he? He told us that we have to come to him as little children. And you know, one of the things about little children is that they are very inquisitive. They take things at face value up to a point. They have a lot of faith. It's amazing, isn't it, that children, they do the most daring things because they have no fear, and we condition them to be fearful. But at the same time, children are always asking the question, why? Little Johnny, go and do this. Why? And of course, the standard answer is because I say so. How dare children be so impertinent as to ask why? Is our kind of attitude. But actually it's good for children to understand why they're being asked to do something. Even if ultimately the answer is because I say so. But in a similar way, as Christian people, if we are going to be practical in our faith, we need to ask why. Why am I doing it? Why do I do the things that I do? And of course, we could come here every week and I could encourage you to go and be practical Christians, to go out and do things, to be seen in the community, to be kind of salt and light in this place. But we need to ask the question, why are we doing it? And today we're going to get to the heart of why we do the things we do. Why are we practical in our faith? And I'm tempted to say it starts with Abraham. It doesn't really. It goes even further back than that, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. But Abraham is a good starting place to ask the question, why? Let's put, shall we, Genesis into context. Genesis is a fascinating book, a bit of an enigma, really. Chapter 11, previous to where we've just read, has that wonderful story of the Tower of Babel. And you're probably familiar with it, but in a nutshell, you remember that the people of all the world were there in this great city of Babylon, and they became very arrogant people, and they said, we will climb our way to God. We're going to build a tower so high that we will actually reach God. And so they started building this ziggurat right up and up and up. And God came down and looked at it. And he said, I need to do something about this. And so he jumbled up their languages. And we're told up to that point, people had spoken one language, and he jumbled up their languages. And that made them very difficult to cooperate. Now, we're a church of people from many parts of the world, and there are a number of different languages that are spoken here. And anyone who has come to the UK not speaking English as a first language will know just how difficult it is to try and live in a society that doesn't speak your mother tongue. There are often mistakes. There are often misunderstandings. Sometimes we find it so difficult that we actually give up the cooperation. And then, of course, the danger is that we become little segregated groups. Well, that's what happened in chapter 11. But what on earth has that got to do with Abraham, or indeed anything else? A little bit before that, of course, we had the story of Noah. And, of course, we all know about Noah and his ark. What's that got to do with Abraham, with the Tower of Babel, or with anything else? And if we were to go previous to that, of course, then we have the story of Adam and Eve. Go right back to the beginning. Adam and Eve, and of course their sons, Cain and Abel, and that terrible murder that took place. And then finally we get to chapter 12, and here is the story of Abraham, and we would say, and perhaps we've often said in the past, that Abraham is the father of God's people. So why doesn't the story start with Abraham? Why don't we miss out great chunks of it? Why do we need to hear about the Tower of Babel? Why do we need to know about Noah? Why can't we just go back to Adam and Eve and then give a list of ancestors, a genealogy, which takes us right through to Abraham, and say, this is the important bit that you need to know. Now, here's Abraham's story. This is where it all begins. This is where God calls a nation, the beginnings of a nation at least, to himself. Well, look, here's the reason I believe that it's all about. Because God's people were always meant to be a people of blessing. I believe that we today are meant to be the people of blessing. We're people who are meant to receive the blessing of God. We're people who are meant to impart the blessing of God. We are meant to be a blessing to people all around us. But that was always God's intention right from the very beginning, was that his blessing would rest on his people. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. God creates the universe. He makes it all. Day after day he creates a bit more, and on the sixth day he made man. And this is what it says in verse 28, having created mankind. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them. God blessed them. And he said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. God's intention right from the very start when he created human beings was he said, I want to bless you. And my blessing will be seen in terms of numerical growth and indeed in power. You will rule. You will subdue the earth. You will become the kings of the earth. We are not an equal species along with chimpanzees. We are God's special people right from the start. But of course we know it all went wrong. I'm saying we soon get the story of Cain and Abel. It only takes one generation before the first murder occurs. Adam and Eve's own sons end up fighting. And fighting over jealousy, because God accepted one offering that was given with a right heart and motive and rejected one that wasn't. In other words, God blessed one and God took his blessing away from another. And that triggered this reaction. And there we have the story of Cain and Abel. And of course this is multiplied now many times over. As people grew, so sin grew. It was in everyone. It was a real epidemic. And God looked down on the earth and he saw just how wicked people had become. And he said, I must put a stop to this. I know what I'll do. Let's have a new beginning. A new beginning. I started it once with Adam and Eve. Let's go back and see what happens this time. And so he chose Noah out of all the peoples of the earth. And he said, Noah, you are the only righteous man left. I'm going to pick you and your family. He had 3 sons. They had wives. Noah had a wife. 8 of them went into this ark that he spent 100 years building, even though they'd never seen rain and were a very long distance from the sea. And through that ark, God saved the human race, and indeed, not just the human race, but also creation as well. It was all there in the ark, and God protected them in the ark, and then they come out of it, and this is what happens in chapter 9 of Genesis and verse 1. They've now come through the flood waters have receded, Noah and his family are out and they're going to start again, and this is what God says. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. God blessed them. God says, my blessing must be now on you. I bless you as my people. You go. And how does God's blessing manifest itself? Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth. Here they are once again. I want you to multiply. I want you to take over this earth. And in taking over the earth to fill it, they're subduing it. They're ruling over it. And so God started all over again. Now, what happens next is that we see that Noah's sons multiply and they become various nations. And chapter 10 is concerned with the table of nations, and it shows how the people had spread out far and wide. But unfortunately, the people were still very sinful indeed. Once again, they were doing terrible things, and God came down and he looked upon them and he said, I see that sin is growing at such a fast rate here. I must slow it down. This time, says God, I will muddle up their languages. I will stop them from being so powerful, so clever. And so we have the Tower of Babel. And God says, now that these people have multiplied and they've gone all over the world, and now I've slowed down their progress and their arrogance, he said, but I still want the people for myself. And then he turns and he says, we will start again. We started with Adam. We did a restart with Noah. And now we're going to do a restart yet again. This time with a man called Abraham. Abraham will be the start of a new nation, a people that will be my own. These people, even though I try to get them back onto the straight and narrow, try and take them away from the sin, I get rid of the sin, the judgment comes on the earth, the people return to their sin again. And God's judgment has come several times. And now he says, having brought the judgment of the languages, he says, this time he says, now I'm going to start with the people and I'm going to purify this people. But you see, God's will was always right from the very beginning that everyone would be blessed. And so he says, now we're going to bless people through this one family, Abraham's family. And so in chapter 12, verse 2 and 3, Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3, we have this wonderful blessing that God brings on Abraham. He has called him. Now, he hasn't just said to Abraham, Abraham, you're a very special person, and I'm going to bless you. He says to Abraham, he says, Abraham, you've got to be separate. I'm going to ask you to do something big. I'm going to ask you to make a tremendous sacrifice in verse 1. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household. Come right away from Haran, which incidentally was in the region of Babylon. The place where the judgment has fallen. God has singled out Babylon. He says, this will be the center of my judgment. Now he says, come away from all of that. He says, and I want to show you now, he says, what I'm going to do. But you must be separate from these people on whom my judgment has fallen. Abraham, come out. Come down to the land of Canaan. A new place where you're going to set up home. And your family will grow from there. So this is what he says, verse 2 and 3. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The very first thing that God says to Abram when he calls him is, I want my blessing to rest upon you. I want to pour out my blessing upon you and subsequently on everyone. I still have a heart for the people of this world. I still want my blessing to fall upon the people of this world. But Abraham, I'm going to do it through you. I don't know what was special about Abraham. I'm guessing that he was a righteous man. I can't imagine that God would have picked someone who was unrighteous. I'm guessing that he was a man who was already worshipping God, even though perhaps he didn't know too much about the God that he was worshipping. I suspect that he was a man who had been influenced, however, by all the idol worship that was going on around him, and yet somehow had kept himself pure. That would have been no mean feat in his day. He was a man who did something different, it seems, to the rest of his family. It's interesting that before God calls Abraham in chapter 12, the very ending of chapter 11 is the death of his father. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran before the move took place. The link has been broken with the previous generation. Now, Abraham, you're free. The ties that you had to your father, the fact that you had to respect and still obey him, even though you yourself were an adult, there was this culture of great respect for the generations there. He says, but now, he says, I've broken that link with the past, and now it's a new beginning. And a new beginning starts in a new place, and with a refreshment of the blessing that I'm going to bring upon you. Now look, we could look at this blessing the Lord has put, and we can break it down, and we can say that as we break it down, there are probably four things really that are said in this blessing. The first one is, the first line of verse 2 is that I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. The blessing was all about multiplication, just as it was with Adam, just as it was with Noah, so it is with Abraham. You will grow, you will multiply, you will become a great nation. You will have many descendants. That's what I want from you. That's the first thing. And he's saying to Abraham, he says, this is how I'm going to bless you. You will know that my blessing is on you when the family starts to grow. When you start to see your children's children and their children too. It's a good job that Abraham lived a long time. But there it is. He began to see the family growing bigger and bigger and bigger. That's the first sign of the blessing. The blessing will be direct from God. That's something we need to understand here. The blessing comes from God. Is the source of the blessing. Anything else, he says, is not from me and is not a blessing. The blessing that is intended for the people of this world, and this goes on, I'm jumping a good few thousand years now, but even to this day, the blessings that people receive in this world come direct from God. And if they don't come from him, then they're not worth having. And we'll try and make that connection another time, but that's ultimately where we've got to go to, is that the source of blessing, even for today, comes right back to God's blessing back in Genesis 1 and verse 28. And so we see that Abraham has been blessed in this way. But then secondly, he says, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. And this can be a slightly difficult phrase, perhaps. I will make your name great. Well, of course, Abraham's name is great, isn't it? I mean, even to this day, the Jewish people will talk about Abraham as being, such an incredible man. The Muslims talk about Abraham too and recognize his greatness. Christians recognize the greatness of Abraham. Yes, his name is great. But of course, it doesn't mean in the sense that someone is going to be famous. It means the person will be powerful. When David was told the same words, I will make your name great, God meant that I will make you powerful. The name of Jesus will be great, which means his name will be powerful. And so it is with Abraham. He says, Abraham, he said, you might be a nobody at the moment, but you will become a very powerful person. And you know what? As we go through the life of Abraham, we see that this person who has come right out of his country, he's left everything that he knows, and he's become a refugee, if you like, in another country. He's there as a foreigner and, living among these people. And yet Abraham becomes more and more powerful as God blesses him, as the family grows, he becomes wealthier. In fact, as we'll see in the story, that as things happen, that God increases his wealth more and more, and others are losing their wealth. And he became such an incredibly wealthy and powerful man in the country that he moved to and adopted. And yet amazingly, we read in Hebrews that Abraham always lived in tents. And he was never tempted to lay foundations. He was never tempted to build, even though God had said, I will give you the land of Canaan. Do you know what? The first thing I would do is I would start a building program. I would buy a plot of land and I would dig the foundations. And I'd say, right, if we've got to get on with this, if God is really going to give this to me, I better start claiming it. But you see, the blessing comes from God, not from me, not from anybody else. The blessing is not from man. And Abraham, had he have chosen to have dug foundations and to build his houses, would have found that, of course, they would have been knocked down. They would have disappeared. Even the greatest of civilizations discovered that no matter how powerful they made their places, nearly everything was razed to the ground. There are just a few places on earth where there are the remains of ancient civilizations. And of course, all of it in ruins. It's interesting, isn't it, that right back at the beginning of Genesis, or in the early part of Genesis, we have the story about the city of Babylon. And Babylon features highly throughout Scripture. At different times later on it becomes a great and powerful nation. It's Babylon where they started to build this tower. Babylon became the great capital city of the empire. And Babylon, of course, today is very close to Baghdad. Yet what is left of it? What's left of Babylon? This great city was destroyed. It's probably an older city than Jericho, and yet Jericho is recognized as being the oldest civilization on earth, the oldest city. Interesting to see Jericho, see what it's like today. See the old ruins. But it was destroyed too. And of course we just build on top and build on top and build on top. See, Abraham would have been foolish to have built a city, because Abraham realized that the city that God was building is not a city with foundations of bricks and mortar, but with the foundation of Christ himself. And he's built on that. We'll come back to that later, another time. Your name will be great, and you will be a blessing. This is slightly tricky, because what does that phrase mean, you will be a blessing? Does it mean you will be a blessing to others? It'd be tempting to read it like that, and many of the commentators read it like that you will be a blessing to others. But then somebody pointed out, then why doesn't it say the word others at the end? Why doesn't it indicate that you will be a blessing to the people? And then why does it say that again further on? Is further on in the blessing a repetition of what is said here in verse 2, or is it something else? And I must admit, I'm leaning towards the idea that it's something else. And I think that something else is this. When it says that you will be a blessing, it means that, in a sense, that there is so much blessing upon you, Abraham, that it's almost like you personify blessing. That wherever you go, the blessing follows. Everyone will recognize that you are the person of blessing. And do you know what? Abraham, later on in the story, we find, of course, that Abraham came along and he made a blessing on a king and a priest. Here is this king and priest. Nobody knew much about him. But he's described as being greater than Abraham. And Abraham blessed him, even though, this is the surprise, that Abraham, you are such a great man. You've become so powerful, your name has become great. And yet when you come to this unknown king, you were a blessing to him. You poured out your blessing. You withheld nothing. You gave of everything that you had. Again, I'm going to say little about that because I'm going to start jumping into another week's talk if I'm not careful. But we'll come back to that later and visit it. But Abraham was a blessing wherever he went. And that is the thing about Abraham, that people notice this about Abraham, is that wherever he went, everything prospered. He was like some kind of spiritual alchemist almost, everything turning to gold. And it wasn't quite literally gold, but everything he did prospered. The blessing was on him. And so he became like this great blessing personified. Wherever he went, he became the blessing. Third thing I notice is this. Again, notice that it's I will. This is God speaking. Everything is from God. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And so he says to him, you don't have to fear anyone. When people see you, if they recognize the greatness that I have put upon you, then Abraham, they will bless you too. They will just want to do good for you. They will want to see you prosper. They will want to see you grow and develop. They will want to be kind to you. And we see that when Abraham came to the sad day when his wife died. He said, I need a burial plot. The only bit of land in Canaan that he ever bought. But he said, I need a place to bury my wife. And so he went, and they didn't want to sell it to him. They wanted to give it to him. Abraham, you have it. Take it. It's yours. We don't want to take any money for it. We want to bless you with it. But Abraham blessed them and he said, no, he says, I will pay the full price. What about those who curse? Anyone who comes against you, Abraham, don't fear them. My hand is against them. You don't have to worry, for I'm with you. I've blessed you, and nothing can overtake my blessing. And so Abraham found that this was true, that whenever anybody came against him, anyone opposed him, that of course disaster came upon them. We could take the story, couldn't we, of Abraham going down with his wife into Egypt. He had a very beautiful wife, apparently. Even at the age of about 65 or something like that, she was still incredibly beautiful. And she was taken. Now, Abraham made a mistake here. He feared. He's human, let's not forget that. But he feared, and so he said to his wife, he said, you are so beautiful, we better pretend that you're my sister, not my wife. Otherwise they will kill me to take you. But of course, they did take her, thinking that she was Abraham's sister. And then the king noticed that disaster was coming on him. So he calls in Abraham, he says, what have you done to me? Tell me the truth. What is going on here? And do you know what? There is something about the presence of God on this man so much that the king, even though Abraham has done wrong, that the king of Egypt sends him away with a blessing. He says, you've done wrong. How dare you bring this on my house? But go and let me give you stuff to take with you. Get out, Bo. I want to see the curse removed from me and the blessing to come back to me. And then finally this, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. comes back to Genesis 1:28. God wanted his blessing upon all the peoples of the earth. It comes back to the blessing upon Noah as they started again. God wanted the blessing upon all the peoples of the earth. And now as they have another restart, he says, I want the blessing on all the peoples of the earth. It's coming through you, Abraham. But not through Abraham as one man, but through Abraham and his family. Through his seed. Now, the NIV very often translates the word seed as descendants. And technically that's wrong. The text never says that. It always says seed. And the translators have said, well, seed, descendant, it's the same thing. But of course, it always has in mind one particular seed of Abraham, and that is Jesus Christ. And everything is always pointing towards the seed, who is Jesus. And they look forward to that seed who is Jesus. Right at the end of Genesis, when Jacob, and that Genesis really, the bulk of it is the story of Abraham's family. And as we start to come towards the end of that initial family that Abraham actually saw, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his sons, of course, that there is old Jacob blessing his sons, and he's taking them one by one, and he's pronouncing the blessing, and the blessing must continue, he says. God has blessed us, he's made us a blessed people, and now he says, I'm going to put the blessing and impart it to each of you. And one by one he took them, and as he took Judah, he prophesied over Judah, and he said the most magnificent words. Here we are, right coming to the end. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. A clear reference to Christ. He says, I look into the distance and I see the Messiah coming. He says, Judah, you hold on to the ruler's scepter until Jesus comes. You remain as kings until Christ comes, and then he will reign forever. That was the promise. And it's through Christ that all peoples on earth are blessed. Because every blessing that is worth having involves the good news of Christ. You can be blessed, in inverted commas, with all the wealth this world has to offer. You can be blessed, in inverted commas, with the best health that anyone could possibly expect, with long years, with a happy family. But at the end of it, we have to leave this world. Then where does the blessing get you? Therefore, the blessing that we impart to those around us, and we do have to be practical in our blessing, but in the blessing that we impart has to in some way involve a proclamation of the blessing that God intended for his people. And that is salvation, the good news of Christ. That's what it's all about, right from the earliest days, right through to the end of time. God wants people to know that he's come to rescue them. He tried with Adam, it failed. He started again with Noah, it failed. He moved on to Abraham, in actual fact the nation of Israel failed. And then came the one, Christ, who could wear the eternal crown, who never failed, who succeeded. And we live in the hindsight of the cross. We live in the shadow of the cross, as somebody described it. We live in a time of momentous blessing where the gospel is more plain than it has ever been before. That's the blessing. And we as a church need to be practical in our daily lives. In our preaching, we need to be practical because it needs to be about the cross of Christ. Because here lies the secret of what God wants for each and every person on this planet.